Hello and welcome to Balancing Act, Life and Struggles of a Teenage Girl, a mental health and wellness and semi-unfiltered podcast made for teens by a teen. I'm your host, Morea, a 16-year-old girl from New York. And here on Balancing Act, I bring you weekly episodes featuring relatable conversations, personal stories, and practical insights to help you navigate life's balancing act and related challenges, and to remind you that you are not alone. When I was at the height of my eating disorder, I felt completely alone, like no one would ever or could ever understand what I was going through. And one of the most dangerous aspects of an eating disorder is how they isolate you and convince you that you're the only one struggling. But the truth is, you're not alone. So in today's episode, I'm speaking with Nic Coppage, a passionate mental health advocate for individuals with marginalized identities, including members of the LGBTQIA+ community and people who struggle with eating disorders. And Nic is also a helpline specialist at the National Alliance for Eating Disorders. But before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that this episode includes discussions about eating disorders and related mental health topics, which may not be supportive for everyone. So, if you're in a sensitive place or feel this content might affect you in a negative way, please consider skipping this episode or exploring resources like the National Alliance for Eating Disorders. Their hotline and website are linked in the show notes. This was one of the first interviews I ever recorded for the podcast. This interview remained one of the most impactful conversations I've had so far, and the insights Nic shares are so powerful, and the tips she shares as well have honestly reshaped the way that I view my eating disorder. So thank you for joining me on this podcasting journey. If you've ever felt isolated in your struggles with an eating disorder, or want to understand what it's like to cope and recover, this episode is for you. Let's dive in.
How did you realize that you were passionate about working to advocate for the LGBTQIA+ community and people with eating disorders?
Yeah, so it's funny because even before I realized myself that I was queer, I was always a really big advocate for the LGBTQ community. Helped start our Gay Straight Alliance in my high school, would always kind of speak out, I guess, against injustices or like microaggressions in class. I grew up in a very conservative area. And so it was something that I just have always had a passion for people feeling safe and welcome. And then, as I realized myself I was queer, that obviously adds another layer onto it. Similarly, with eating disorders, well, my sister had an eating disorder when I was younger. So it was always something that was in my world. And I developed an eating disorder myself when I was I would say it started late high school, but I was diagnosed in college. And I was someone who lived in a larger body for most of my life. So it didn't go treated or noticed until I got like really sick. And I hated the idea that like so many other people were in a similar spot as me. So I really wanted to pursue my master's in social work, which, would give me the clinical skills as well as advocacy work to
Yeah.
focus on really folks in larger bodies and queer folks with eating disorders, but also just eating disorders in general, I would say.
Would you say that eating disorders are more prominent, like among queer people than people who aren't?
Yeah, so it is a pretty well known and researched fact that
Yeah.
LGBTQ humans are at higher risk for eating disorders. I think that's for a lot of reasons. And I would say that with most marginalized identities, there's this idea of the minority stress model, which is essentially that when you are in a marginalized identity, you are at higher risk for poor mental health and physical health outcomes. And that gets even higher when you have multiple marginalized identities. So, say you're gay and a person of color, or in a lower socioeconomic status and disabled, that rate kind of increases. I think it's related to, with LGBT humans in specific, I think it comes with a lot of pressure on the body. There's, a lot of pressure to like look a certain way if you identify as queer, especially if you're a transgender or non-binary human. I think there's
Definitely.
a lot of stereotypes about like you have to be thin and tall and very androgynous. So when you don't fit those ideals, you're going to do anything you can to get there. And then with our trans humans, it's a form of gender affirmation a lot of the time, making their bodies look a certain way. And unfortunately, what maybe starts as a, healthy or light-hearted thing when combined with like other mental health diagnoses, stressors, predisposition can very quickly go from just eating or moving a certain way or certain behaviors to an eating
Yeah.
disorder, which is really scary.
Yeah, I know that eating disorders are extremely complicated and that a lot of factors contribute to their development, one of them being like biology and predisposition to having an eating disorder. Looking back on your own eating disorder journey, what factors do you think contributed to your development of an eating disorder? Like, was there anything external anyway that you were treated like in high school that may have influenced your development of an eating disorder?
Yeah, I mean, I always think back to a very specific moment where I really became, I would say, like conscious of not just my body, but my body size. And it was actually when I was in kindergarten and I was a size 6X as opposed to just a size 6 in comparison to some of the friends that I had in like my kindergarten class, which is crazy to think about that I was that young and being cognizant of like, oh, I am bigger than my friends. And so I don't hold any ill will towards my parents. I think they were doing the best that they could. And I mean, I was put on Weight Watchers when I was maybe
Oh my gosh.
11. Yeah, like 11 years old. I mean, I had body image issues, so they thought they were helping, but it really made me very cognizant or even more cognizant of food and weight. And like I said, my sister had an eating disorder. So I think in my head, I was like, "Oh, well, because I know what that looks like, that will never be me." Or because my sister did this eating disorder behavior and I don't do
Mhm.
that, then that must mean I'm okay. And, years later, find out that's not true, right? But I was always the bigger friend. I can remember, never being able to like buy my prom dresses in the same stores as my friends. I had a lot of crushes where I liked the boy, he liked my best friend, so I connected that with body size and my physical appearance. And I also just I have a lot of trauma, and I think part of controlling like my body and my food and my exercise was a way of holding feeling like I had control over something when the rest of my life, like especially my senior year of high school, was very, very tumultuous and very traumatic related to family stuff. So it was a way to
Yeah.
feel like safe and in control when I didn't feel that over a lot of areas of my life. I also transferred colleges after my freshman year of college. So like the gym and eating was like a way of like coping with those feelings of like, stress and anxiety and all of that. And again, it just very quickly spiraled into an eating disorder and people were concerned, but I was also always like, no, I've got it. I've got a hold on everything. Like I'm
Yeah.
I'm perfect. I'm cool. Don't be concerned. So I would push people away when they asked to help me or asked if I was okay, which let it again spiral even further. So there's a lot of pieces there.
For me personally, mine started to seriously develop during COVID because you're just like the world just changes in like a split second and you feel out of
Right.
control. And I feel like eating disorders, food and body stuff, uh, it's just something to focus on and something to
Yeah.
try to find stability in. And
Yeah, I also feel like during COVID, there was like an influx of social media content of
definitely,
like
definitely.
keeping like the COVID-15 off and like it was just an
Yeah.
even higher pressure on like everyone was like posting routines and dieting tips. And so it's like I feel like that probably also, didn't
Yeah.
help anyone.
Yeah, you're in a position where everything feels so out of control and you're looking for something to control and then you're bombarded with like messages that, hey, here's something that you should be controlling. And then
Right.
a lot of that stress and anxiety just kind of goes
It
into
all
food and
compounds.
exercise. And
Yeah.
yeah, so eating disorders are extremely sneaky, like you were saying. Like other people say, like, "Are you okay?" And you're like, I'm fine, I'm fine." And they're so sneaky because they blend in with your thought, and
Mm,
you convince yourself that your eating disorder is what you truly believe. And like
right,
I found like with myself, I still really struggle with it, separating like what would be like what's my eating disorder
right.
versus what do I really want? And how do you recommend identifying the difference between your eating disorder thoughts and your thoughts? And then how do you take the step to reach out for help when it's an eating disorder?
It's so hard, like you said, and even though I consider myself, like, recovered and in recovery, I still see a therapist who specializes in eating disorders because I
Mhm.
know that they can be so sneaky and they can still creep in so quickly. And I think for me, something I wanted to pay attention to was I was seeing other women and men and humans in general, like, in larger
Yeah.
bodies than mine, and I thought they were stunning. I thought they were beautiful. I thought they were so attractive. And it was like having that moment of like, okay, I'm saying this about this person. And why am I like the unicorn? Like, why am I different? And again, looking at my friends and thinking about how I would speak to them versus
Mhm.
myself, and kind of starting to draw that line of like, okay, if this isn't something I would say like my best friends, or if it isn't something I would encourage my best friends to do, chances are it's not value aligned. And like revisiting what it was that I truly valued. Because when I think about my relationships, when I think about the people I want in my life, I never think about their bodies. I never think about the ways that they eat. Like, and, starting to make that distinguisher of like, here's what Nick cares about and wants and believes, and here's what my eating disorder is telling me. And that also, especially like when I was like really in the beginning stages of recovery, it was a lot of leaning on my supports. I had a boyfriend at the time who was incredible. He held a lot for me and helped me in a lot of ways. And like probably every day, multiple times a day, I was texting him, like, here's what my brain is telling me. Does this make sense? Is this me? Is this the eating disorder? And, he would kind of talk through it with me. And of course, with respect to his boundaries, if he couldn't do that or didn't have the space, I didn't expect it. And even when it felt uncomfortable, having at least one person that I could go to and say, like, here are the thoughts I'm having right now. I don't know what to do with this. Whether that was like a loved one, if it was a therapist, a dietitian, and really letting those thoughts come into the light, because I think eating disorders also really thrive in secrecy and
I
isolation.
totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And so not letting myself fall into that, even when I wanted to like pull it back and like not reach out.
No, it's the same for me too. I talked to a therapist, and it feels so relieving to be able to say, I'm having thoughts of restriction or something. And then my therapist being able to help me realize that's your eating disorder. And that one of the biggest steps you can take towards eating disorder recovery is, being able to say, like, that's my eating disorder. And other
Mhm.
people holding you accountable for that, like you're saying, and helping you to differentiate between the thoughts. That's such an important step. Do you remember any pivotal moments in your eating disorder recovery that helped to set you on the path for recovery? Like for me, it was a really scary moment when I went to the doctor. I almost had to be
Mm.
hospitalized.
Yeah, there were a couple. I think the first time, and this kind of touches on like the last like question and idea too, is before I was even telling myself like this is an eating disorder, because I didn't know. I didn't know if it was. And my eating disorder didn't want me to see it that way. I was visiting with some friends, who one of which was majoring in college in exercise science. And I made like just a small comment of like, I think I do hit workouts and intense workouts, but like they're probably not. It's probably not really like that intense. And she was like, oh, well, can I ask like what your workout looks like? And so I gave her kind of like a rundown of my movement routine, and she kind of got this look on her face and she was like, that's a lot. Like, that's even more than I do, and, like, this is my whole professional world, and I was like, "Oh, okay." And she was then like, "Do you mind if I ask, like, what your eating looks like?" And so I again, I told her I counted calories, I counted macros, and, I told her roughly the calorie count that I was eating at the time. And she, and of course saying this as like a non-clinician at the time, but was like, "You were really under eating. Like you were really under eating and really over exercising. Have you ever talked to like your doctor? Have you talked to a dietitian?" And in that moment, I kind of felt that internal panic of, "Oh no," like it almost felt like I've been caught. And I went back to school and like after that weekend, I went back and made an appointment with my counseling center at my college and found someone on the website who had eating disorder experience and, saw her, was really scared about it and kind of told her everything and could kind of tell like she had this look on her face like, you know, and I know, but we're not going to name it just yet. And so like the second or third appointment, I was like, "Do I have an eating disorder?" She just kind of looks at me and she's like, "Yeah, you do," which was really scary, but I'm a perfectionist. I don't wanna stress people out around me, so naturally, I was like, "Okay, well, I have to start working on this right now," even though I don't
Yeah.
know if I was really ready. So flash forward, I'm working with, like my university had, like, an eating disorder team, they called it, so it was like you saw a dietitian, a therapist, the doctor, and flash forward to that winter break, I went on a ski trip with my boyfriend at the time, and it was him and his family, and I hated every minute of it. I had no control over my food. It was so cold, and I was cold all the time, so I was
Right.
miserable, like, wearing my ski jacket in the cabin, and I think the pivotal moment kinda that you're talking about was I was upstairs in, like, the bedroom, and he walked in from doing something, and I was laying on the floor and had been doing sit-ups, like, in the room when I'm supposed to be on this, like, ski vacation with, like, my boyfriend's family. I was hiding in my bedroom doing sit-ups on the floor, and he looked so sad, and I was so sad, and I just started crying, and I told him, I was like, "I wanna be the perfect anorexic." I was like, "I wanna be perfect at anorexia, but I also wanna be perfect in recovery. I don't know what to do." And sweet boy, like, he didn't fully know what to do, but he was great. He was very supportive, and from that point, I did go to treatment. I got back from that, like, winter break and had written out a letter again because I think eating disorders and perfectionism and, like, people pleasing
Yeah.
go very hand in hand. So, while this made my eating disorder, like, scream at me, I had written a whole letter, like, to my therapist and my dietitian being like, "Here's everything I did over Christmas break that engaged my eating disorder. Here's my, like, weight. Here's what I was eating," and we, like, agreed it was best that I went to treatment, which not everyone has the luxury of doing, I'm very aware, but it was, like, that moment of, suppose like, to be on this beautiful, like, trip to only have it, like, ruined by my eating disorder was really, like, I think, the biggest moment that kinda set me on that path.
Eating disorders can become so all encompassing and just consume so much of your life and make it so that you can't really enjoy moments. And I too have found times where I'm on vacation, and vacation is always a really hard part for me too because you can't control your eating. You're so far
Mhm.
outside of your normal environment. And a lot of the times vacations are supposed to be relaxing. So exercising is like not really something that's part of the plan.
Right.
I,
And it's such a different routine than normal. Or like birthdays or like holidays, things like that, suddenly you want to be present. And all of a sudden all you can think about, like, or all the eating disorder lets you think about is food, exercise, movement. What do you look like? What are you wearing? And like that's not how we're supposed to live life, like especially as like teens and like young adults. Like that's like the last thing you should be thinking about. And it makes me really sad for, like, past me. I mean, she's done a lot of work, proud of her, but, like, it's a sad thing when you really, like, step back and you're like, "Oh, like, that was my life for a period of
yeah.
time."
Yeah, like the other day I was scrolling through my phone and I found like pictures of me when I was 13 or like even when my eating disorder was first starting to develop and I saw pictures of myself and I was like, I look so young. How could such a young person be so obsessed with how they look? Why is that what they care about? If I could go back and talk to myself, I'd be like, Mariah, like, you're you don't this is not what you need to be focusing on. Like, there's so
Right.
much more to you. I try to remind myself that if I were to look back on me now in 5 years, I wouldn't tell myself now that I should be watching what I'm eating and like that should be
Right.
consuming my life. I
Yeah,
it's
exactly. Yeah, I have a niece she's gonna be 2 in July, and, like, all I can think about when I'm with her, like, not all I can think about, but a big thing I think about is, like, I don't ever want her to go through that, and, how is, like, her aunt and, like, as a figure in her life, can I make sure that food is just a thing that exists. Her body is just a thing that exists. No one's immune, of course, to body image struggles or depression or anything like that. But how can I try and create that little bubble? Because, like, when she's running in her bathing suit, through the sprinkler, she's not at 2 years old thinking, oh my gosh, what does my body look like right now? Or how many steps am I getting in? She's just existing. And, like, how beautiful it would be if we can all get to that place. Something I
yeah,
think about a lot.
yeah. But it can be so hard to try to get to that place. What can we say to ourselves that is practical and doesn't seem so far out of reach that reminds us to work towards trying to get to that place?
Yeah, I think something that my therapist said to me actually, like, within the last, like, probably 3 or 4 months or so, um, first of all, was the reminder that, like, your positive affirmations or your reminders, whatever you would like to label them as, like, don't have to be the same ones that, you might see, like, a therapist post on Instagram, or, that you think are these, like, lofty, out of reach reminders, because at the end of the day, passive affirmations or the way you speak to yourself isn't going to necessarily help if it doesn't feel authentic to you. So I think, being realistic with yourself of where you are, what feels good to you, like, even like language, like if you're more of like a sassy, like, sarcastic person, maybe your positive affirmations are going to reflect that. If you're more like you need like the soft and cuddly and like gentle, the way you speak to yourself should reflect that. But I think for me, and something I remind myself of a lot, and my therapist reminds me, and something I tell people on the helpline at my job is like, it's okay to strive to just be neutral. I think there's a lot of pressure that we have to be like all the way up here and we have to love our body without any moment of doubt. We have to love being around food without any pressure. And sure, that's a great goal to have. And I would hope that one day, I can confidently say I'm in that place. But also, it's okay to just want to be comfortable and neutral with your body and food, and to be able to say like, okay, this is the body I'm in and it carries me through the day, and that is so great. And you know I have days where I love how I look and I'm like, wow, I'm beautiful, I'm stunning, my body is fantastic. And there's still days where I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, oh, like I wish I could change this, or I wish this looked different. But like
Yeah.
pulling myself out of that and being like, okay, but I'm not only my body. There's so much more to me than my body. And sometimes striving for neutral is like the best we can do. And I think like a lot of times, like, especially when you are either at the beginning of your eating disorder or you're still kind of in the depths of it, it's really hard to imagine a life outside of it, and like a life where your body and food don't matter so much. So if you're that entrenched in your eating disorder and you're trying to push yourself to absolutely love your body and practice intuitive eating without fault, that's probably not realistic. So being gentle with yourself and saying, okay, I can't be there right now, but I can at least be here, and what does that look like for me? And taking some of that pressure off, I think is really important too.
Something that my therapist, my doctor, my dietitian, everyone says it's that like eating disorder recovery isn't linear. You don't go from having a severe eating disorder to being like perfectly cured of everything. It's something that is always going to be there, and it's just how you cope with it and what you tell yourself.
Which is
And
frustrating because you want to be able to fix it overnight, but just like an eating disorder doesn't develop overnight, it's also not gonna
mm,
just all go away and be fixed overnight either.
it's more about like learning how to cope with it than just trying to
Yeah.
like get it in your entire body. So you work as a helpline specialist, as you were mentioning. What would you find are the most helpful things to tell people when they're really struggling with an eating disorder?
So I always start by reminding them just how brave it is to ask for help because that can be the scariest part of the process. I feel like, especially in a world that I feel like is so focused on perfectionism, people pleasing, hyper individuality. It's really scary to call and ask for support. So I always start with thanking them for sharing their stories with me and reminding them that this is the first step. It's also really important for me and something I always make sure to do, kind of like what we talked about earlier, is making them aware that they are not their eating disorder. And some of the people that call are not at the place to see that yet. They're still very, entwined. And I can hold space for that. I can have empathy for that. But reminding them you are not your eating disorder and you didn't cause it. You didn't ask for it. No one wakes up one day and wants to have an eating disorder because I think something I hear a lot from the people who call our helpline and from our group members is a lot of frustration of I know better or I know this is bad for me or I don't like engaging in this behavior but I can't stop. And reminding them that eating disorders are not just a matter of willpower or wanting to change. They go so much deeper than that. And especially too when family members call, because we do have like family members or friends who will call sometimes and just ask for, how to support their loved one and making sure they understand that too, because I think it's really easy to assume it's just about the food or it's just about the behavior and they should just eat more, eat less, just stop throwing up or stop going to the gym. And it's helping them understand that it's never just what's on the surface, it's everything that underlies it. And a lot of what I do as well is honestly just holding space for these people to share because again it's something that a lot of them have not had the chance to really openly talk about before. So sometimes my calls will literally just be me pretty much in silence, maybe throwing out a I hear you, I understand, that's so valid every so often, but really just letting them share and get this off their chest and giving them the space to not have to hold it all alone because it's so hard. And when you're, feeling this like internal battle and like anger and sadness and anxiety and all of this, sometimes it's just nice to have somebody hold a little bit of that for you. And if I can do that for someone, make them feel not as alone, it means I've done my job. It means I've done what I believe is the purpose for me. So, yeah, we get a little bit of everything. And I, of course, tailor it to whoever's calling or the goal. Some people only want resources. They don't want to talk at all. And that's totally okay too. But yeah, it's a lot of just relationship building, honestly, and pulling them out of that spiral, I think.
Like we were talking about before, eating disorders are extremely isolating and they thrive in secrecy. So, when you can find the courage to talk to somebody about it, even if you're not looking for an answer, that's a huge
Yeah.
step forward.
Yeah. And I always want to make sure like the people that I'm speaking with know that I don't expect anything I say to just suddenly change their whole life or, fix it. Very honestly, I've had to tell people before because they'll call in and say, well, how do I stop having an eating disorder? And I'm like, I wish I had an answer for you that was that simple. I don't, but we can talk about the steps that you can start recovering. And parents who are like, why won't my kid eat? And I'm like, I wish it was that simple. But and connection. And even if they're not ready to see a therapist or see a doctor or go to treatment, even just getting them connected to like a support group can be a great first step to, like you said, build that community and kind of break down that isolation a little bit.
And if you're a friend to somebody who suffers with an eating disorder, what can you do to support them? Because, like you're saying, telling them just eat or like stop going to the gym, stop throwing up, that doesn't really help.
Yeah, I think the first thing is holding holding space for them to share their story with you. And that might include too, if they're not ready, asking those kind of hard questions. I think a lot of times supporting someone with an eating disorder brings a lot of discomfort for both parties, I would say, and being willing to embrace that and say, like, I know this is hard to talk about, or, this is going to be hard for me to hear, but I want to understand what's going on. Education is a big one, making sure you're educating yourself on eating disorders. And while your friend can do some of that, I always encourage, doing a little bit of digging on your own because, chances are they're looking for support. They might not have the mental space to like also be your teacher all the time. I always encourage loved ones and friends to encourage the person who has the eating disorder to get professional help if they don't already. Because again, as we've talked about this whole time, they are a mental health condition. There is so much more that goes into them. So reminding your friend that they are deserving of support, they are deserving of care. They don't have to try and solve this all on their own. I think or as intuitive as it might feel, don't make your whole friendship or whole relationship about the eating disorder and food and movement because, again, your friend or loved one is still a person outside of their eating disorder. So, of course, while you want to offer them that space to talk to you about that side of things, also like just doing things that bring some joy, whatever that
Yeah.
looks like for them, so that, they can also connect with themselves outside of the eating disorder.
Yeah.
And then I also honestly always recommend making sure the support person, again, whether that's, friend, family, has their own supports as well, because it is
Yeah.
really hard seeing your loved
Yeah.
one go through any kind of mental health crisis.
And,
And it's great to support them, but you deserve support as well,
yeah.
whatever that looks like.
And I have a past with an eating disorder. You have a past with an eating disorder. How do you help somebody with an eating disorder without it possibly triggering your own eating disorder thoughts? Because that can be really challenging.
It definitely can be. I think for me, it was definitely making sure I was at a good place before I went out and did that. And sometimes that looked like I've had other friends, who dealt with eating disorders as well. And when I was really in like the beginning stages and like more in the beginning stages of recovery, that did look like sometimes telling my friends, like, hey, I love you so much, but I don't think this is good for either of us, for me to be the one supporting you in this right now. I can take you out to the movies. We can talk about your crush. We can complain about teachers. But when it comes to eating disorder stuff, I don't think it's healthy for either of us for me to be the person you go to. And that's a
Yeah.
really hard conversation, but it's an important one because you want to be able to show up for your friend in the best way possible while also taking care of you and prioritizing your own
Yeah.
recovery. The Alliance actually, when I did an internship there before I worked there after my undergrad, and at the time to be an intern, they did request that you were at least, I believe it was either 1 or 2 years in recovery if you had an eating disorder because they didn't want you to get triggered. I think definitely, like I said, I personally choose to have an eating disorder specialized therapist in case these things come up for me and being able to talk that out. And also just knowing your own boundaries because there are
Yeah.
some things with eating disorders that once it hits like a certain point, I like don't necessarily have the space to hear that. I think it's a lot easier when I'm at work, whether it's on the helpline or in my private, like my groups or with my private clients. It's easier for me to hear about, of course, because these aren't necessarily people that I know. But when it's the people that I, have in my day to day, it's a lot more of a touchy personal subject. And
Yeah.
being able to set my own boundaries. And most of the people in my life who I've had to set those with understand and respect that and actually really value it. Because again, we
Yeah.
care about each other and don't want either of us getting hurt.
Yeah, and eating disorders are so tied to perfectionism and also people pleasing, so
Right.
it can be especially hard to say no when
Right.
somebody reaches out for support and
Yeah.
space.
And reminding yourself that you are not selfish for needing to prioritize yourself. And that sometimes selfishness is self-preservation, which can feel really heavy and intense, but you're allowed to care about yourself. You're allowed to put your own needs first, which is a really hard thing to learn and is something I am still learning to this day. But also practice makes it easier to accept.
Yeah.
So
And also, if you're in a better space, then you'll be able to help somebody else. So you just have to take care
exactly.
of yourself first. It's like that airplane thing you put on your own mask to help
Yeah,
the other person.
exactly.
So yeah. So while being a helpline specialist can be challenging, like what have been the most rewarding aspects of your work helping people with eating disorders?
I love what I do. L- love being able to show up every day and be that safe place for so many people. I was gonna try and put a number to it, but I don't think I could do that actually. Some of my favorite moments really are when someone might come in to the start of the call being really in denial or being really scared of getting help or, again, like saying like, no, I don't need resources. I'm fine. I just need to talk. And then by the end of it, 30 to 45 minutes in, they're like, I think you're right. Like, I think I do need help or I do want support. And that's just really cool because really I didn't do anything with that. They had to come to that in themselves. Sure, I guided them that way, but they ultimately make that decision to say, actually, yes, here's my email, here's my zip code. Like, please help me find places. One of my favorite calls was I had someone in their 30s or 40s, I believe. And not only was it their first time being validated in their eating disorder, they also had never had someone validate their gender identity before. So I told them, I was like, because like one of the questions we ask is like related to gender, just because, some therapists only see certain populations and things like that. And they were like, oh, well, I guess technically I'm a man. And I was like, oh, well, if you don't identify as a man, that's okay. Like, I want to make sure I'm referring to you appropriately. Like, are you trans feminine? Are you non-binary? Do you use they them pronouns? And they were like, no one has ever taken the time to ask me that before. And I was like, oh my gosh. Because it was like my two favorite worlds colliding. So that was really a really beautiful experience. I have had again, just like moments where people have just like cried on the phone because they're like, this is so scary, but I'm calling and I'm talking about it and I'm asking for help. And I'm like, yes, you are. Like, I feel like my approach can sometimes be a little more cheerleadery, mom
Yeah.
friendly, but like seeing people prioritize themselves, even when they don't always feel like they deserve it, is like such a beautiful thing. And at the end of the day, like I don't know, right? If they call those therapists, I don't know if they go through with,
Yeah.
whatever kind of game plan we came up with. But even knowing I'm just like a step in their journey and like that still calling and like asking for names or talking about it like is still such an important part of the process. It's a really
Yeah.
beautiful thing to see.
Yeah. And for listeners who, hopefully by listening to this feel validated in their eating disorder journey, what resources would you suggest that they look into, like the National Alliance for Eating Disorders that you'd recommend?
Yeah. So Alliance on our helpline, we are all therapists or like master's level therapists or higher who answer. So you will be talking to someone who knows what they're talking about. And, you know, there's different levels. Definitely like a therapist and a dietitian can be a great starting point because, just like a gentle start. And preferably ones who specialize in eating disorders, just because they are so tricky and a little bit more nuanced. But also things like support groups. The Alliance does have groups. They're unfortunately only 18 plus at the time, but we do have some adolescent, like 17 and younger groups that we can definitely get you connected to. I think there are some, like, I know some high schools or like even communities, right? Like have like eating disorder advocacy groups that you can join. I think is That was something I did way back when as well in college. That was, again, kind of helped me come to terms with having an eating disorder. As scary as it can be, I think cluing in your parents is so, so important. And a reminder that your parents are never going to be mad at you for coming and asking for help and being honest. So making sure to clue in your parents. And there are a ton of parent support groups out there as well. So if you think your parents could use some education or support, those are out there as well. And I think, not eating disorder specific, but just continuing to surround yourself with community is so, so important. Because as we have said so many times today, eating disorders are really isolating and can be so, so harmful. So making sure to surround yourself with good people. If you're still in high school or in college, a lot of times you can speak with your school nurse or school social worker and, can also, if that means eating meals in like the nurse's office or in a teacher's classroom to kind of have you some of that added accountability, I think is also, a very plausible and like very doable thing in most school settings.
Thank you so much. This has been such an amazing, insightful conversation. And I just have one more question for you. So, if you could share one piece of advice with your teenage self, what would it be?
It would be to understand that none of the things that happened to her were her fault. And she is not responsible for holding all of that on her own. And
Yeah.
so she deserves to ask for support, whether that be
Yeah.
her friends, teachers, pushing more hard to get a therapist earlier than I did. Yeah, because I think so much of my mental health, my eating disorder, like so much of it is all really tied in that central idea of holding all of that on my own. But things could have potentially been very different had that not been the case.
Yeah. And I guess that's just like that's why I've created this podcast. I want listeners to know that they're not alone, and I want to be able to give the advice to other people that I wish had been given to me when I was like
Right,
struggling with this.
right,
And
which is
so
so, so needed. So, so needed. And it can also be different to hear it from someone, more in like our age range, because it's one thing to like hear someone on TV or, an older woman from your church or school say something as
yeah,
opposed to like, someone closer to when it all went down. So I think it's such a great idea,
thank
like
you
such a great way to
so,
form
so much.
community.
Thank you for sticking to the end of this episode of Balancing Act featuring Nic Coppage. It was a bit of an emotional roller coaster to record, but I hope that it's helped you. So here are my biggest takeaways from the conversation, and there are quite a few. So, starting off, everyone's experiences are different, but all experiences are equally valid, and every single person is deserving and worthy of support. The second thing was that you can't fix an eating disorder overnight. Eating disorders are complicated. There is no one thing you can do to get rid of it. 3. Everyone has different affirmations that work for them. They don't have to be what you see on social media because it's all about what will motivate you, what resonates with you. 3. One of the hardest parts of having an eating disorder is feeling like you have to hold it all on your own. But you don't have to because there are people out there who can help you and who want to help you. 4. It is so brave just to reach out for help. And it can be so validating for someone to just hold space for your feelings and your experiences. 5. You are not your eating disorder. It may seem like it's consuming you, it may seem like it's all you are, but there is so much more to you than your eating disorder. Like we mentioned earlier in the episode, the Alliance is an amazing resource, and I've included their hotline number and website in the show notes if you want to give them a call or check out their website or just use some of the resources that they have. Because, like I said before, there are people and organizations out there to help you. So reach out to them. And so, thank you again for listening to this episode. This episode holds such a special place in my heart because It is one of the conversations at the beginning of this podcast journey that really just reinforced to me the importance of continuing to have these conversations. And so listening back to this, it just shows me how much I've grown through my podcast, how much the podcast has grown, and I hope this conversation can help you to grow too. Thanks for listening to this episode of Balancing Act: Life and Struggles of a Teenage Girl. If this episode resonated with you, or if you know someone it could help, please feel free to share it with your loved ones or on social media. You can find us on our Instagram at balancingact.podcast and on our website balancingact.life. So please consider checking those out and giving our Instagram a follow. If you want to support the podcast, please consider subscribing to the podcast or leaving us a hopefully good rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on, because that would really be invaluable. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, or if you want to suggest a topic or person for a future episode, please reach out to us through social media, our website, or email, which you can find linked below. Thanks again for taking the time to listen. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, life's a balancing act and sometimes you're gonna fall on your face, but you're not alone.